morning is Luke 22:54, 7:3 through 7:1, and Luke 23, 1 through 5. So we'll be here a little bit. See? Then seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy, who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. At daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. "Are you the Messiah?" they said. "Tell us." Jesus answered, "If I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." They all asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He replied, "You say that I am." Then they said, "Why do we need any more testimony? We have heard it from his own lips." Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king." So Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. Then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." But they insisted. "He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here."
So we read the part just before Janet's reading a few weeks ago, right? That's the part where Judas comes up and betrays Jesus with a kiss, and then Janet starts reading, "Then they arrested him and took him away. Peter follows behind." And then it skips over to the place where he's brought into the court and accused formally. So we've gone through this whole entire chapter of Luke 22 and starting into Luke 23 here toward the end of Lent. And it's been kind of good to do, hasn't it? To break down the story as we go along a little bit. It's sometimes just read and never really pondered. And so I'm glad that I decided that maybe that would be something good for us to do this year. This day, however, has this theme that surrounds following and leading, and when do you follow and when do you lead, and when is the crowd voice important and when is the crowd voice going against your beliefs. As children, we learned the playground games, follow the leader and Simon Says. And one of the rules of those games is to follow exactly what the leader tells you to do, right? And there's a lesson to be learned in following. I mean, it's why those are childhood games. There's a lesson to be learned in following someone's directions that they give you. Someone in charge tells you what to do. There's something important about knowing that, especially in an environment like, say, a school classroom. It's important for there to be some person who is entrusted to the care of everyone in that space, and so some kind of rules or expectations have to be set up. And following people is not a trait that, by and large, is necessarily bad. But another thing that we learn in school is that we shouldn't follow the crowd, right? That thinking with our own mind and standing on our own 2 feet is also a very important part of becoming a mature person. So our whole lives long we struggle then, don't we, with that concept of when to lead and when to follow and when to judiciously decide for ourselves what the right path might be. A childhood game is one thing, but life itself, that's something different in the way it all plays out. And in this story of Jesus and the disciples, we have a little bit of all that. Jesus tells the disciples early on, before we started reading, "Come, follow me." And they do. But along the way, he didn't just tell them every single thing to do. He gave them some agency too. He gave them authority. He tells them along the way that they too can heal the sick. They too can care for those in trouble. He gives them leadership roles in this makeshift movement that they're creating. He's clearly the leader, but they're not blind followers. They have this agency and role to play in this whole discipleship game. So naturally now, in this really serious moment when they're all huddled together and scared of what will happen next, it's hard for them to know what to do. And naturally, like we see with Peter and with Judas and some of the others, people do begin to get scared and just start doing whatever they think will save them in that moment. The thought of what is best for the whole group suddenly goes out the window in the moment that Jesus is arrested. And we talked about that before. There's some logic to that. It would be really hard in the midst of all that chaos and panic and fear to think about what was best for the group instead of just yourself. That kind of fight or flight mentality takes hold. The thought of continuing to follow Jesus becomes too dangerous now for the most part and for most of them. And so then there's Jesus. Here's Jesus standing before Pontius Pilate, the leader in this particular situation. The whole assembly and the crowd in this story is not like a crowd of just random bystanders. This is a crowd of religious leaders, like annual conference. Ew, that's a terrible thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
Scratch that. But this is the entire religious assembly. These elders and these chief legal experts are standing here together, all accusing Jesus of claiming to be the Messiah and thus trying to usurp the authority of Caesar. The church and the state were in total relationship with one another in this particular part of the world at this time. They're threatened by the teachings of Jesus and how they seem to go against the legalities of the church and the state. And then Jesus has these really standoffish answers, doesn't he? He responds to their questions with answers maybe you don't even like. Answers like, you say that I am, and that's what you say. And it infuriates them even more. Interesting stuff going on down in this chapter, Luke 22 and beginning of 23. This crowd of religious leaders is telling this state leader, Pontius Pilate, to arrest this guy for trying to take over and create some other sort of law and order. And Pilate looks over, the legal rule of the day and says, he's really done nothing that I can see that breaks any law. And he's pretty firm in that assessment of what following the law is and what following the law isn't. So then on both sides of this equation, you have people insisting that there's this rule of law to be followed and obeyed. And it seems that no one knows exactly where Jesus really fits into the rule of law here. And that makes sense because he doesn't. You see, Jesus did not try to follow an expected pattern of behavior. Jesus had this larger goal in mind. You know this. Jesus was trying to connect everyone into this larger arc of God's love for all people, not this small worldview that the religious leaders had of people must do things in a certain way to receive God's mercy. The larger thing at play here, though, is how hard it is to get out of that box that we collectively put ourselves in together. The ways in which the leadership together cry out against Jesus becomes this powerful force that not even Pilate can stop. That old concept we were warned about in school to avoid. Don't try to follow the crowd. Instead, learn to follow your own principles. That really plays itself out here in this passage. Jesus and the disciples weren't following the crowd. And in this passage, at least at this point, neither was Pilate. Pilate was saying he's done nothing wrong. Jesus was saying not much at all. But the crowd of religious leaders keeps on insisting that things go their way, that Jesus really is a threat to them, that he really must be stopped. And this is just crowd bullying, right? That's what it is. If Pilate, and then actually later Herod too, had really stood their ground and claimed their authority, then Jesus would not have been tried and found guilty. They both say there's no basis for holding him captive, because right after what Jenny read today, Pilate hands him over to Herod, and Herod says the same thing. We have no reason to keep him. But the crowd continues. The roars of the crowd and religious leaders are strong and loud, and ultimately the crowd wins the day. They bully the authorities into convicting Jesus. Which makes you wonder what kinds of crowd bullying we get into today as a church. Is it hard for us to stand individually against the masses? In what sorts of circumstances do we have to stand up for what we believe in ourselves, rather than listening to the mad shouts of the crowd that we hear around us? When do we stand up for the teachings of Christ as opposed to just blending in? It's hard to see the crowd moving a certain way, or the leadership of an organization moving a certain way, when you feel in your own heart that you just can't move that way. Maybe you felt that at work, in your professional life. Maybe you don't approve or didn't approve of the way some upper management might be running things, and you question whether you should stay or go. I know I've done that more than once, both as a teacher and as a clergy person. Sometimes the leadership is easily able to get the masses in the crowd on board, and sometimes they aren't. But when you feel like your voice and your set of principles is being drowned out by the crowd's voice, it's hard to know what maybe your next move should be. In fact, churches struggle over this all the time. And sometimes the crowd voice takes over in ways that lead denominations to split. It's one reason we have so many denominations. In our own denomination, people have struggled mightily over the years to deal with the pull toward one crowd or another on all kinds of issues. In fact, I've talked to more than one member of this church sitting here today. I've talked them to please hang around just a little bit longer when they said they're going to walk away because of the United Methodist Church's stand on homosexuality. And I said, hang around with us a little bit more. Let's fight from the inside. And sometimes that's hard. Sometimes that's hard when the crowd seems to scream the loudest, that screams against what your heart is saying to you. And sometimes even within your own heart, you aren't sure which crowd to follow. And that's because life's not easy. And of course, on our world stage, the bullies seem to be taking center stage and harassing all of us into listening to their rhetoric, even if we don't want to hear it. It makes you want to, it makes me, I won't speak for you, to retreat into a corner and just stay there. It's hard to make up your own mind about something when you can't even think because of the constant stream of rhetoric being thrown your way. And ultimately, that is what happens with Pilate. He knows in his heart that Jesus did nothing wrong, but he lets those voices of the crowd in his head overtake his rationale, and he gives in. And then Jesus goes to the cross. So it's important for us to read this at least once a year and remember what happened, not only with Pilate, but also with all the religious leaders in this story. The roar of the crowd leads to the thinking that he must die instead of some other sort of urging in their own hearts. If they really looked at Jesus and his followers and really listened to his message, they might not have been so quick to condemn Jesus as radical or extreme. But they decide that if someone is coming into the synagogue and turning the tables over and trying to change things, then he and his followers have to be bad. And so they begin this steady drumbeat to rid the world of this troublemaker. already talked about this, but that's what happens when fear takes over. For the religious leaders first, I think, but it's also what happened with the disciples too, with Judas and with Peter and the others. But you'll notice in this passage that Janet read for us today, fear does not take over with Jesus. Jesus stood strong. Jesus believed firmly in his message of God's inclusive love. And so Jesus let the crowd yell out against him. Jesus did not walk away. And Jesus did not argue and become caught in some endless debate. He let them fight it out amongst themselves, all the while keeping his heart and his head focused squarely on God. So, in the end, the only leader we need to follow here is Jesus. We listen for that still small voice in our hearts that reminds us how Jesus stood strong against this tide against him. And thanks be to God, Jesus let love prevail. Anytime that we read this passion story and find ourselves playing some of these lead roles, and we play them all at one time or another, Judas, Peter, Pilate, choosing to betray or stand to the side or give in to the roars of the crowd. It's important when we catch ourselves doing one of those lead roles that we refocus on Jesus instead, on what Jesus says and doesn't say, on what Jesus does and doesn't do. He's our role model here. He guides us on this risky journey, a journey that might even end in great sacrifice. But Jesus shows us above all others who have ever walked the earth what it means to let love guide your heart and your every decision and your every action. Our instructions here today from this passage as Christian people is to be willing to head toward that end goal that Jesus guides us toward, that goal of being perfect in love in this lifetime. God help us. Amen.